Okay, I'm ready. I'm sorry.
You got your mic on? Let's see.
Yeah, I guess it's right there.
It is, it's good, it's excellent.
Okay.
Okay, we are rolling. Anytime you're ready, Joe, or
Introduce myself. Hi there. You ready? Hi there. I'm Joe Fava, or Joseph Fava, and I'm sitting here on the stage of the Schenectady Civic Players. And I've been involved here for a good many years. I hate to think about it, but it's probably, I walked in the door sometime in the 50s. It's a organization that has been here since 1926. It actually existed a couple of years before that. It was started by a couple of Union College professors, Professor Herrick and his wife, and then David Smart. There were about 4 people. Alice Ripley was another person. They started the theater to do community theater. They were performing in the high schools. I believe it might have been Mount Pleasant or wherever they could get a stage, they would probably do a play. This building was a Masonic temple at one time. It was I think if you look at the stained glass window in the front, it has a stained glass of St. George and the Dragon. I think it was connected with St. George's Church, but I'm not quite sure how that worked out. If you look at my picture here, this is the building I'm talking about right here. It looks pretty much the way it looked back in the 1850s when it was built, 1856, I believe. The building next door here, which was a private home at one time, and we are in the Stockade area, obviously, in Schenectady, was a private home. This was purchased many, many years ago by the Red Cross, and this building became available in the 80s when I was on the board, and we decided to buy it because at some point we're going to do an expansion and connect these 2 buildings, which we're actually doing right now. We're doing a fundraiser to raise somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 to put in an elevator for handicap and become ADA accessible. So that's a project that I'm currently working on, and we're about halfway there, and if things work out well, we plan on starting the project in May. Anyway, to get back to the original intent, when they bought this building, what existed here was this stage, but if you can see behind me, that backstage area was not there. There was a winding staircase that came up in the corner from the kitchen downstairs. The actors used to come up to get on stage. It was the only way they could get on stage. So the kitchen area downstairs was where they used to dress and everything, and then they would come up the winding staircase and get on stage to perform. When they first bought this building, that area behind the camera, which I think he's going to take a picture of afterwards, was flat. And the arches had all little lights in them. So it looked, we have an original picture of the way it looked. It looked very much like a Masonic temple and what they're supposed to look like, or the ones I've seen. The back wall did not exist. It went right to the stained glass window. Actually, I had that put in when I was on the board back in the 80s. That's where our lighting and sound booth is. So we've done a lot to the building over the years. We are one of the 3 oldest continue operating theaters in the United States and New York State. I think 2, and I say continue operating in the same location. There are theaters, obviously, that are older, but we've never moved our location. A lot of the older theaters in New York or all across the country have moved from one location to another. But we have been in this location for 86 years, going into our 87th year. We've always been sort of part of the Stockade, which is really nice because we get a lot of people that obviously come in from the Stockade to see our shows. We've always done at least 5 shows a year from the very beginning. Our season runs usually between October and May. We don't have this building open in the summer, which is one of the things we'd like to correct with air conditioning and a new furnace, so that we can partnership with the new community college theater program, and we do have groups that really want to use the theater because we don't use it in the summer. And we also have a partnership with Proctor's that we're working on, that they can use it in the summer too. It's a great little theater. It used to have close to 300 seats. We took a lot out in the back row to build the lighting and sound booth, but we're up to like 274, something like that. At one time, when I was first involved in the theater, you could not get a seat in this theater for the entire run, which was 2 weeks. Theater has changed over the years, so most of our sales now are night of the performance, and we do have quite a few subscribers and patrons, obviously, to keep us going. Probably at least 200 or 300 of those. If you go downstairs into our theater, you'll see we have a large green room, which actually was only half a green room at one point. The costume department was on the other side. When we bought the building next door, we moved the costume department next door. We used to own the building to the right, which we sold back in the 70s. We used to have our costumes there too. The kitchen area downstairs and the dressing rooms were put on in the 50s, the late 50s, and the backstage area was put on in the late 50s. We have 2 large dressing rooms. We have bathrooms for the actors. It's probably the best equipped community theater in upstate New York. I can't think of another one that is as well equipped or as can serve the public as well. Albany Civic actually is really well equipped, but it's a very small space in Albany Civic. And they still have a entrance problem to the theater, to the actual stage, which we actually were able to correct because of the land and the size of the building. One of the things that's interesting is that if you know Schenectady at all, most of the people that actually worked here were not actually from Schenectady. GE used to be very well employed at one time with a lot of the advertising departments and artists and people who would do a lot of their graphic work, and people who've come from all over the country have worked here. One of the directors that I worked with and learned a lot from was from Texas, and actually when he retired went back to Texas. We had people from really all over who, it was very heavily involved with the General Electric employees at one time. I think people who probably were involved in the theater, professional people, and then decided that they weren't going to make a living doing it, went on to work for a corporation and taught. We had one lady here who actually was Patricia Neal's roommate at college at Northwestern. She was a great actress. She's since passed away. Jean Kestenbaum was her name. And she used to talk about Patricia Neal, and Patricia Neal got a job interview to be in a play. And I can't remember the play right now, except if I said it, you know it. And they actually had Jean, they wanted Jean to come and interview, but Jean decided she was going to finish her classes at Northwestern. And Patricia Neal went and got the part, quit school, and of course went on to be a great actress and won an Academy Award and everything. And Jean stayed in school and ended up here at the Schenectady Civic Players. We had another lady here, Marion McKendry, who was just a marvel. She's probably one of the best people we've had in upstate New York, actress-wise. She actually used to tell stories about David Selznick and how he asked her to, she was beautiful. The lady was, when she was young, she was absolutely stunning. Asked her to audition for Melanie in Gone with the Wind. And she tells the story on how she went to Mr. Selznick's apartment, and the casting directors were there and everybody, and they wanted her to read, and she did. And she said if she couldn't read for Scarlett, she wasn't interested in Melanie, and which went to Olivia de Havilland. And she said, well, here I am back at the Civic Players back in the early years. She came up here in Schenectady and ended up, her husband was with GE, and that's how she ended up here. It was interesting because we always sort of doubted her stories. We never were quite sure, but then when she passed away, I received a lot of her pictures and autographs from all kinds of famous people she was involved with. And so actually came to think, well, yeah, the stories were all really true. You know, we tend to, in the theater, tend to embellish on a lot of things, but she was friends with Betty Hutton and all kinds of people that were involved in early Hollywood. So it was kind of interesting. The other thing about the theater is that we actually put all these new seats in here back about 5 years ago. That was a seat campaign, and to the tune of about $80,000, and it was all pretty much paid for by the patrons. Their names on pretty much all the seats. So that's pretty much quite an accomplishment for for a theater of this size and a community theater to be able to do things like that. I first walked in the door and I met a lady when I first walked in. I was just a kid. And I was always interested in theater, and if you know much about education in the early years when I went to school, they really didn't offer anything to us. Now we have a fabulous theater department at Schenectady High School. When I went to there, it was called Lytton, and I went to 1 year at Knott Terrace, and then the last years at Lytton High School. But we only did one show a year, and they do a musical occasionally. But now they have a very active theater department, and I often thought if that was there when I was a kid, it might have really made a big difference in my life. And I was always looking for something to do, and I always was involved in the school, but there really wasn't very much. So I walked in here one day, and there was this lady, I'll never forget it, sitting at the front desk, and she said, "Do you want to sign up?" And I signed up. And she said, "My name is Connie Sykes." I'll never forget her. She was a very dear person. We became very good friends. And she, not at the least of it, she had a very beautiful daughter, which actually interested me. I was like 18 years old. And she had a son, and she was a divorced woman. She lived over on Green Street, right next door to where the Bradens lived, or the Dale Miller and Zoe Oxley live right now. We became really good friends. She was older than I was, but she was really a very good mentor, and she got me involved in doing props and doing one thing and another, which led to me directing here. And I'm the longest and oldest director here now. I never thought I'd say that, but I've done more shows than anybody, and there have been some very good people that have worked here. And through her, I met, obviously, her daughter, Carol, and next door to her were the Bradens. Very, very interesting family. I don't know if anybody's talked about them before on any of this. He was a GE lawyer and worked at the big GE building in New York City. We used to go down to visit them, and he was way up on the top. So he was quite an interesting character. He used to do stamps. He used to sit at his desk doing stamps all day long. And Mrs. Braden was very, I guess if it was unconventional, she was not what I would call, at my age, looking at her to be a normal individual. Now I can understand, being older, but when you're young, you kind of look at adults and go, boy, are they crazy. She never wore shoes. She used to walk around the stockade barefoot in the winter yet too sometimes. And she used to walk down to the pool down at the Harlow's, and she'd just walk down there. It would be 5 below, she'd go swim. If the pool wasn't frozen over, Mrs. Braden was in it. And they always had hours that people could go, but she never paid attention to that. She had 3 kids, Ann, Danny, and I can't think of the other boy's name, but Ann and I, again, became real good friends. So it was Carol, Ann, myself. There was a fellow named Dick Wendover who lived down here. He became a close friend, and there was Harry Tryon, who lived down the street, and George Hosmer, who was a good friend. He lived up on Green Street, actually where you live, next door to where you lived. He became a close friend. He's in New York doing theater now. And Harry's passed away, and I'm not sure about Ann. I know the Bradens are gone. They were much older, but they had a wonderful dog named Sam. There wasn't a person in the stockade that liked that dog. He would chase people and bite them for no reason at all. I was one of the lucky people because he liked me for some strange reason, but he was just a terror when he got out of the house, and she couldn't control him. And we used to call him like a flying scatter rug. He looked just like a scatter rug running down the street, but he would bite people, and just to run up and bite them. And of course, it caused a great deal of havoc in the neighborhood. And she was always out there trying to explain how loving the dog was, but nobody ever saw that if they were bit by the dog. But it was quite a household. I spent a lot of time there, and then I became a member of the St. George's Choir, back when it was just an all-boys choir, young boys and older men. It was like 3 age groups, but there was all men. And Mrs. Braden went to St. George's Church. I have a feeling that they ended up here because they were Episcopalian, and they went to St. George's. And we were having a rehearsal one time, and Mrs. Braden used to wear shorts all the time, and she would be barefoot. I'll never forget, we were having a rehearsal, and Mr. Monks was conducting. It was always Thursday night, and Mrs. Braden walked in and sat down in the men's choir. Well, if you know anything about the old rules, you didn't do that. And he stopped the rehearsal, and she said, he said, Mrs. Braden, what are you doing? And she said, I'm going to join the choir. And he said, you can't. It's a man and boys choir. It is not for women. And she said, well, I'm sorry. This has got to change. We got to have women and men in this choir, and I'm staying. Well, she stayed for the rehearsal, but it was a big hoopla. I remember Father Kirby, and everybody would be running around in circles because of this woman. And eventually they talked her out of joining the choir, but now they have what we would call an integrated choir, men and women. But she was the one that really sort of got them thinking about it, but they weren't about to give in. I guess, if you go back to old England, and they were all men and boys and the countertenors and whatever, it was great fun singing in the choir. We used to get a real kick out of Father Kirby. He was very dramatic. I don't know if anybody's ever talked about him. He was quite a dramatic individual. And we used to watch, of course, when you were involved in the church and you were there every single Sunday for like many years, you used to see Father Kirby do these wonderful sermons with all these wonderful gestures. So we used to call them like the crucifixion gesture, and then there was the Easter gesture, and then there was this gesture. Well, we had names for all these gestures that he would do. And if you watched him long enough, he was like an actor. He would use the same gesture with the same word every single time. So we in the choir we used to sneak in tape recorders. Back then they were a little larger, so you had to be really clever about this. And we would tape his sermon, and then we would put the gesture with the word, and we would really have it worked out so that we knew that if he was going to say risen, the arm would go up, or hell, the arm would go down. So it was real. I hadn't thought about this in years. Just thought about it now. So we used to do that, which wasn't very nice. They sort of found out about it. Mr. Monks found out because he saw the tape recorder, but he didn't stop us, which was even more interesting. His son was in the choir, but he knew we were doing this, but he didn't stop us. And but he was a character. Father Kirby. He was really quite an individual. He used to drive down North Ferry Street the wrong way all the time. He didn't care that it was one-way street. Never cared. And if there was an empty driveway, he'd pull right in it and park his car and go into church. It didn't matter to him that it might be somebody else's driveway. He would just do that. He felt he had the privilege to do that. And actually, nobody ever really complained about it. So it was just him. I was sitting in my Volkswagen one day out in front of the church. Had a yellow convertible back in the 60s. And he came out one day and he says, hello, it was a Sunday. Hello, young man, how are you? And I went, oh, I'm good. And he said, did you go to church today? And I went, yes. Where'd you go to church? I said, Father Kirby, I'm in your choir. Oh, good job. And he walked away my immediate reaction was, oh God, I won't say it on camera, but you know how kids are. So anyway, that was that. I mean, we had a very active, fun time here. I went to school with the Harlows and the Colangelos. I didn't necessarily grow up right here. I grew up on Seward Place, real big house on Seward Place, but I had relatives down here. So I was here a lot. And then we moved down here, my mother and I, back in the 60s. I lived at 32 North Front Street, where Robert Woods lives. I lived back there in the 60s. They had a big apartment in the back at one time. I think he changed it. Susan Stafford, the family changed it to 2 apartments, but there was a big one back there, which my mother rented. And I remember we used to get all our meat at Arthur's. They had a great meat market there back in the 60s and 70s, and even when we didn't live in the Stockade, we used to get all our meat there. I sort of got off track. So there was, we were very, very crazy, I could say. We never did any damage to anything, but we were like just nuts. I think it's just being young. I mean, we went to Woodstock the first time. We got in our car, all 4 or 5 of us in my Volkswagen, and drove to Woodstock, and I was 68 or something, and thought we'd stay there for just one day, and of course we couldn't get out. I never saw so much mud, naked people in my life. But that was kind of fun. At the time, I'm not sure it was fun, but thinking about it now at my age, it was really kind of a fun experience. I'm glad I did it. But anyway, we used to raise hell. One of the things we did, all the kids in the neighborhood had we called it a duck club. We had a duck club. In order to join this duck club, you had to go around anywhere and find a duck on somebody's lawn and steal it. in order to be part of our club. And I don't think many of the people in the Stockade even knew about this, but we were very active, and and every once in a while, a new member would come in carrying a duck. And, and we had to change the rule. We said this one person, we didn't like him very much, and I'm not going to say who he was, but he lived we live on Front Street. So we told him in order to join our club, he had to get us something bigger, like a deer or a horse or something on a lawn, and he could join our club. I mean, we were really exclusive, you know. And we had a Skidmore girl involved. We had somebody from Vassar with Swarthmore. Ann went to Swarthmore. So we were like high-end club. We had a high-end club, and we were really tight. Well, didn't this kid show up one day with a donkey, it was like a Spanish donkey, and it was huge. It was cement, and he brought it into the Braden's backyard, and they weren't home. And he said, look what I found on some